The United States Constitution said almost nothing about the right to vote until the ratification of the 15th Amendment in 1870. The 15th Amendment declares that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Why was this necessary? And how well was it enforced? Hi, I'm Evan Bennett, and I'm Professor of History at Florida Atlantic University and Director of the Voting Rights History Civic Literacy Project. And I'm here with 3 things you need to know about the 15th Amendment. 1. The 15th Amendment was passed and ratified in response to struggles over the political rights of African Americans in the post-Civil War South. After emancipation, the question of African American political rights remained unresolved. The Dred Scott decision of 1857 had denied citizenship rights to African Americans at the federal level. Abolition ended slavery, but it did not resolve the question of what rights African Americans had in America. Those that attempted to recreate state governments in the wake of the Civil War assumed that African Americans had no political rights. Southern states, in fact, denied them rights to many things, including the right to vote. In response, Congress passed a Civil Rights Act in 1866. It established that, except under a couple very specific conditions, all people born in the United States are citizens of the United States and have equal protection under the law. In 1868, Congress went even further and ratified the 14th Amendment, which forever established that those born in the United States are citizens and have equal rights. Section 2 of the 14th Amendment also established that states that denied the right to vote to men could have their representation reduced in Congress. It was an indirect attempt to protect the voting rights of African American men. There was much discussion about the language that specified that voters would be men, but Congress decided to leave it that way despite the protests of woman suffrage advocates. While the language of the second section of the 14th Amendment was indirect, it did open the door for widespread black political participation. Hand in hand with white allies, African American voters built up the Republican Party in the southern states. White Democrats in the southern states resisted these gains, often with violence. Recognizing the challenge this resistance presented, Congress ratified the 15th Amendment in 1870. African Americans across the nation celebrated the 15th Amendment and its protection of their right to vote. They saw the 15th Amendment as their protector of their right to vote, and their right to vote as their protector of their ability to participate fully as citizens of the United States. Unfortunately, they did not benefit from its protections for very long. 2. While there was strong federal support for defending the 15th Amendment shortly after its passage, enforcement soon waned. Section 2 of the 15th Amendment empowers Congress to pass laws to make sure that the 15th Amendment is not violated. In 1870 and 1871, Congress passed laws called the Enforcement Acts to do just that. It did so in response to increased violence against African American voters. Despite early successes in prosecuting some organizations like the Ku Klux Klan, the violence continued. After a massacre of African American Republicans by a militia of white Democrats in a town called Colfax, Louisiana in 1873, the federal government attempted to prosecute members of the militia. After much legal struggle, the Supreme Court decided in 1875, in a case called United States versus Cruikshank, that the United States government had overstepped its bounds in attempting to go after the militia members. The Cruikshank case undercut the Enforcement Acts and severely limited the ability of the federal government to protect the voting rights of African Americans. Following Cruikshank, violence against African American voters continued to increase across the South. By the end of the 1870s, African American political participation was severely reduced and would continue to decline until the early 20th century. 3. The power of the 15th Amendment was weakened by the Supreme Court and by Southern states beginning in the 1880s. As Southern Democrats returned to power, they feared that continued violence might prompt Republicans in Congress to step in to ensure African American voting rights. So they began seeking ways to use the law to deny African Americans their right to vote. They had to make sure, however, that they never expressly violated the 15th Amendment. They began with subtle laws that dealt with the practice of voting. These laws were race neutral in their language, but those that passed them knew the effect would be to reduce African American participation. They enacted complicated registration laws, for example. Some states enacted multiple ballot box laws, which made it harder for illiterate voters to cast their vote. It also made it easier for poll workers to reject the votes of African Americans. Aside from these laws, 3 methods of limiting African American voting were widespread. Literacy tests proved to be especially powerful, not only because African Americans had long been denied educational opportunities, but because these laws empowered voter registrars to decide who was literate and who was not. In the hands of these registrars, even African Americans with significant educational attainment could be denied the ballot. Illiterate white voters, meanwhile, could be empowered by these same registrars. They could use tools like the grandfather clause, which allowed anyone to vote even if they couldn't read, provided they'd had an ancestor who'd voted prior to the passage of the 14th Amendment. They could also use the understanding clause, which gave registrars wide latitude to determine if someone understood what was read to. Between 1890 and 1908, 7 southern states passed literacy test laws. Poll taxes were another way of limiting African American voting rights. Requiring voters to pay a tax in order to vote was nothing new in American history. In fact, many northern states had poll tax laws as well. The amount of the tax, or requirements that voters pay the tax 2 years in advance, or that they pay all back taxes before being able to vote, severely affected the ability of poor people to vote. Indeed, many poor white folks found it difficult to vote because of the poll taxes. All southern states had some sort of poll tax in place by 1904. Seemingly race-neutral laws, like challenging registration laws, literacy tests, and poll taxes, were legal because of a case called Williams versus Mississippi that the Supreme Court decided in 1898. Decided 2 years after the more famous Plessy versus Ferguson case, the court decided in Williams versus Mississippi that states could put whatever restrictions they'd like on voting so long as they did not expressly violate the language of the 15th Amendment. This allowed things like poll taxes and literacy tests and complicated registration laws. But they weren't the only way that southern states flouted the 15th Amendment by the early 20th century. Creation of the primary election in the early 20th century was probably the most effective tool for disfranchising black voters. By the early 20th century, the Democratic Party had the loyalty of almost all white voters in the South. This meant that the winners of the Democratic primary elections almost always won the general elections. In order to prevent African Americans from voting in Democratic primaries, state Democratic parties declared themselves to be private organizations and limited membership to whites only. These primary elections came to be known as the white primary, and combined with other laws, effectively eliminated African American voting in much of the South by the early 20th century. It wouldn't last forever, though. However weakened, the 15th Amendment remained an important and viable part of the Constitution. And as we'll see, later generations used its promise of a multiracial democratic republic to guarantee voting rights for all.